You know that feeling when something's been happening right under your nose for weeks, maybe months, and you just never noticed? Like when you finally realize your neighbor's been stealing your newspaper every morning. Or when you discover that weird noise in your attic wasn't pipes settling after all. Well, what I'm about to tell you falls into that category, except it's about 1,000 times more disturbing. I'm talking about shadows. Your shadow specifically, and I bet you've never really paid attention to what yours does when you're not looking. I mean, why would you? It's just supposed to follow you around like some dark, silent copy of yourself, right? Well, 3 months ago, I discovered that assumption was dead wrong. My name's Alex, and I live alone in this old Victorian house that I inherited from my grandmother. It's one of those places with creaky floors, drafty windows, and way too many mirrors scattered throughout every room. My grandmother had this obsession with mirrors. I never understood it until recently. Now I think she might have been trying to keep track of something. The whole thing started on a Tuesday night in September. I remember it was a Tuesday because I'd just finished binge-watching this documentary series about unsolved disappearances, and I was feeling pretty paranoid about everything. You know how it is when you consume too much true crime content. Every shadow looks like a potential intruder. Every sound becomes a possible break-in. I was getting ready for bed around 11:30, going through my usual routine. Brush teeth, wash face, check that the front door's locked for the 3rd time because anxiety is a hell of a thing. As I was walking past the hallway mirror, something caught my eye. It was subtle at first, just this nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. Have you ever looked in a mirror and felt like your reflection was just a split second behind? Like there was this tiny delay between your movement and what you saw? That's exactly what happened. Except it wasn't my reflection that was delayed. It was my shadow on the wall behind me. I stopped walking and turned to look at the actual shadow cast on the hallway wall. It was there, perfectly normal, mimicking my pose exactly. I raised my hand, and it raised its hand. I tilted my head, and it tilted its head. Everything seemed fine, so I convinced myself I was just tired and seeing things that weren't there. But then I noticed something else. The shadow seemed darker than usual. Not just regular shadow dark, but this deep, almost black void kind of dark. It was like someone had taken a permanent marker and traced over the edges to make them more defined, more substantial. I shook my head, told myself I was being ridiculous, and went to bed. But sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about that moment in the hallway, that split second where my shadow seemed to have a mind of its own. The next few days passed without incident. I went to work, came home, lived my normal, boring life. But I started paying more attention to mirrors and reflective surfaces. Not in a vain way, but more like I was conducting some kind of ongoing surveillance operation. I'd catch glimpses of myself in store windows, bathroom mirrors, the black screen of my turned-off television. Everything appeared normal. It was the following Monday when things got weird again. I was working late in my home office, probably around 10:30 at night. The room has this massive window that faces the backyard, and with the desk lamp on, it creates this perfect reflection of the entire room. I was typing away on my laptop when I happened to glance up at the window. My reflection was there, hunched over the keyboard, fingers moving across the keys. But my shadow cast by the desk lamp onto the wall behind me wasn't moving at all. It was just standing there perfectly still while I continued typing. I stopped moving my hands and stared at the window reflection. My shadow remained motionless for another 2 or 3 seconds before suddenly snapping back into position, perfectly matching my pose as if nothing had happened. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. I started documenting everything. Timestamps, locations, lighting conditions, anything that might help me figure out what was going on. Most of the time, my shadow behaved normally. It followed my movements, matched my gestures, stayed properly attached to my feet like shadows are supposed to do. But every few days, I'd catch it doing something off. Sometimes it would lag behind my movements by a few seconds. Other times, it would seem to move slightly before I did, like it knew what I was going to do next. And occasionally, very rarely, I'd spot it in my peripheral vision doing something completely different from what I was doing. The really disturbing part was that it only happened when I wasn't looking directly at it. The moment I focused my attention on my shadow, it would snap back to normal behavior. It was like it knew when I was watching. I started wondering if I was losing my mind. Stress-induced hallucinations, maybe some kind of neurological issue, or just plain old sleep deprivation catching up with me. I made an appointment with my doctor, got a full physical, even requested some basic neurological tests. Everything came back normal. Perfect health, they said. No signs of any medical issues that would cause visual disturbances. That should have been reassuring, but it actually made me more anxious. If there was nothing wrong with me medically, then what the hell was going on? I decided to set up a camera. Nothing fancy. Just my old digital camera positioned to capture both me and my shadow during my evening routine. I figured if something weird was happening, I'd finally have proof. Either I'd see the strange behavior on video and know it was real, or I'd see normal shadow activity and know I needed to talk to someone about my mental health. The first few nights of recording showed absolutely nothing unusual. My shadow behaved perfectly, following every movement with precision timing. I started to feel relieved, thinking maybe whatever had been happening was over, or maybe it had all been in my head after all. But on the 4th night of recording, something happened that changed everything. I was reviewing the footage from the previous evening, fast-forwarding through the boring parts where I was just reading in bed. Around the 11:45 mark, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the video, I could see myself clearly lying in bed with a book. But my shadow on the wall was gone, not behaving strangely, not delayed or moving independently. Completely absent. I rewound the footage and watched it again in real time. At exactly 11:43, my shadow simply faded away, like someone was slowly turning down the opacity in a photo editing program. It disappeared completely for about 2 minutes, then gradually returned, growing darker and more defined until it looked normal again. During those 2 minutes when my shadow was missing, I looked perfectly fine on camera. I was still reading, still occasionally turning pages, completely unaware that anything unusual was happening. That's when I realized this wasn't just some weird visual quirk or medical issue. something was actually happening to my shadow. Something I couldn't see or feel in real time, but something that was definitely real. And if my shadow could disappear for 2 minutes without me noticing, what else might it be doing when I wasn't paying attention? I had to find out where it was going. I set up multiple cameras after that. One in the bedroom, one in the living room, one in the hallway where I'd first noticed the strange behavior. If my shadow was going somewhere during those disappearances, I was going to figure out where. The next night, I positioned myself in the living room and waited. I had my laptop open with all 3 camera feeds visible, watching myself and my shadow from different angles. For the first few hours, everything looked normal. My shadow stayed put, following my movements exactly as it should. Then at 11:52, it happened again. On the bedroom camera feed, I watched my shadow fade away from the wall, growing lighter and lighter until it vanished completely. But here's what really freaked me out. On the hallway camera, I could see a shadow moving. It wasn't my shadow attached to my body. It was my shadow, walking independently down the hallway, moving with purpose toward the front door. The shape was unmistakably mine. The same height, the same proportions, even the same slightly slouched posture I have when I'm tired. I jumped up from the couch and ran to the hallway, but by the time I got there, nothing was visible to the naked eye. The cameras were still recording though, and when I checked the footage later, I could see my shadow had continued moving through the house while I was chasing after it. This became my new obsession. Every night I'd set up my surveillance system and wait for midnight, because that's when it always happened, right around midnight. Sometimes a few minutes before, sometimes a few minutes after, but always close to that witching hour. My shadow was leaving me every night at midnight, and I had no idea where it was going or why. I started following the footage more carefully, tracking its path through the house. It always took the same route, down the hallway past the kitchen toward the back door. But here's the thing that really messed with my head. The cameras could see it, but it wasn't casting any additional shadows of its own. It was like watching a shadow of a shadow, this dark shape moving through my house without any physical form to create it. After a week of documentation, I decided to try something different. Instead of just watching the cameras, I was going to follow it in person. If my shadow was going somewhere every night, I wanted to know where. At 11:45 the next night, I positioned myself near the back door with a flashlight and my phone to record. I figured if I couldn't see my shadow with my naked eyes, maybe the phone camera would pick it up like the other cameras had. Sure enough, at 11:58, I felt this weird sensation, like something was being pulled away from me. It wasn't painful, just this strange tugging feeling, like when you're half asleep and feel like you're falling. I looked at my phone screen and saw my shadow moving past me toward the back door. The door didn't open, my shadow just passed right through it like it wasn't there. I grabbed my keys and went outside, scanning the backyard with my flashlight. The yard was empty, but when I held up my phone and looked through the camera, I could see my shadow walking across the grass toward the old oak tree in the corner of the property. That tree had been there since before my grandmother bought the house. It was massive, probably over 100 years old, with thick branches that created deep pools of darkness even during the day. My grandmother used to tell me stories about that tree when I was a kid. Weird stories about how it was planted on a grave, how sometimes she'd see things moving around it at night. I'd always thought she was just trying to scare me the way grandparents do with ghost stories and urban legends. But watching my shadow approach that tree through my phone screen, I started wondering if maybe she'd been trying to warn me about something real. My shadow stopped at the base of the tree and just stood there for about 10 minutes. Then it started moving again, but not back toward the house. It began walking in a circle around the tree, slowly, methodically, like it was performing some kind of ritual. I tried to get closer, but every time I took a step, my shadow would pause its circling and turn toward me. Even though I couldn't see it with my eyes, I could feel it looking at me through the phone screen. It was the most unnerving sensation I've ever experienced, being watched by your own shadow. After 20 minutes of circling the tree, my shadow started walking back toward the house. I ran inside and positioned myself in the living room, pretending to be asleep on the couch. Through the camera feeds, I watched my shadow come back through the back door, walk down the hallway, and return to my body. The moment it reconnected with me, I felt this rush of exhaustion, like I'd just finished running a marathon. But I also felt something else, something that took me a while to identify. I felt informed, like I'd learned something important, even though I had no memory of learning anything at all. The next morning, I researched everything I could find about that oak tree. Property records, historical documents, old newspaper articles, anything that might explain why my shadow was so drawn to it. Most of what I found was pretty standard stuff. The tree was planted in 1892. It had survived several storms and a lightning strike in the 1950s. But buried in some old city council meeting minutes from 1947, I found something interesting. There had been a proposal to remove the tree because of recurring incidents of unusual activity reported by several residents in the area. The proposal was ultimately rejected, but the meeting notes mentioned nocturnal disturbances and unexplained gatherings near the tree. That's when I started wondering if my shadow wasn't the only one making midnight visits to that oak tree. I decided to set up a camera in my backyard aimed directly at the tree. If other shadows were gathering there, I wanted to see what they were doing. The first few nights showed nothing unusual, just my shadow doing its nightly ritual of circling the tree. But on the fourth night, I hit the jackpot. At exactly midnight, shadows started appearing from all directions. They emerged from behind houses, slipped out of garages, materialized from dark corners of yards throughout the neighborhood, all converging on my backyard, all heading for that ancient oak tree. There were dozens of them, maybe more. Different shapes and sizes, clearly from different people, but all moving with the same purposeful determination. They formed a large circle around the tree, and then they began to dance. I know how that sounds. Trust me, I questioned my own sanity watching it happen, but there's no other word for what they were doing. It was a slow, rhythmic movement, almost hypnotic to watch. They moved in unison like they were following some choreography that had been rehearsed for years. The dance lasted exactly 1 hour. At 1 in the morning, all the shadows dispersed, returning to wherever they had come from. My shadow was always the last to leave, walking slowly back to the house while the others faded into the darkness. I realized I was witnessing something that had probably been going on for decades, maybe longer. A nightly gathering of shadows that their owners knew nothing about. But why? What was the purpose of this midnight ritual? I started paying attention to my neighbors during the day, looking for any signs that they might be experiencing the same thing I was. Most of them seemed completely normal, going about their daily routines without any indication that their shadows were leading secret lives. But Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down started looking exhausted all the time. Dark circles under her eyes, moving more slowly than usual, like she wasn't getting enough sleep, even though I never saw lights on in her house past 10 o'clock. And Mr. Chen across the street began complaining about weird dreams, mentioning to other neighbors that he felt like he was walking in his sleep, even though he always woke up in his own bed. The more I observed, the more I realized that everyone in our neighborhood was being affected by whatever was happening at that tree. We were all unknowingly participating in something we couldn't see or remember, but I could see it now. And that knowledge was both a gift and a curse, because once you know your shadow has its own agenda, you can never quite trust the darkness again. The question that kept me awake wasn't just where my shadow was going anymore. It was what it was learning during those midnight gatherings, and whether someday it might decide not to come back at all.